Richard Roos. In February 1531, Richard Roos worked as a cook to Bishop John Fisher when he was accused of having poisoned the bishop's dinner. As it turned out, Bishop Fisher had no appetite that day, so the food was only eaten by his guests, 2 of whom died. The rest suffered from side effects for the rest of their lives. After his arrest, Richard Roos claimed he'd only added a laxative to the meal as a practical joke, with no intention of harming or killing anyone. He was not believed and was sentenced to death by boiling. He was repeatedly lifted and lowered into a cauldron of boiling water until he died. Some pregnant women reportedly fainted at the sight of this never-before-seen form of torture, but most spectators were not fazed. Georgi Doja. Georgi Doja was a soldier who led a rebellion against the Kingdom of Hungary's nobility. Once captured, he was subjected to a truly horrifying punishment. He was forced to sit on a scorching hot iron throne, wear a burning hot iron crown, and hold a hot scepter. Some of his fellow rebels, who had been starved for some time beforehand, were brought before him. The executioners used red-hot pliers to pull flesh from his body, and the starving rebels were ordered to bite off and swallow the flesh where the pliers had burned him. Any who refused were killed. Al-Qaid Malik. Al-Qaid Malik was a Moroccan governor under Emperor Moulay Ismail in the early 18th century. In addition to being charged as one of the chief rebels in a rebellion incited by one of the emperor's sons, the empress was angry over his beheading of one of her cousins. The emperor sought out a carpenter to administer his idea of a just punishment, sawing Al-Qaid Malik in half. He was taken by mule to a public square where thousands of his relatives and members of his tribe were gathered. To their horror, Al-Qaid Malik was strapped onto a board and placed upon a saw bench, his arms and legs fastened. The executioners started to saw him from the head down, but the empress's sons demanded they begin from the groin and move upwards, or he would die too quickly. As Malik screamed in terror, they began to saw from the other side. Once they reached his navel, they pulled out the saw in order to begin again from his head. Malik, still conscious, begged for water, but his friends did not want to extend his suffering. The executioners continued to saw him from the skull down until he split in 2. Peter Stump. Known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, Peter Stump was accused of and confessed to, under torture, being a werewolf, serial killer, cannibal, and practitioner of black magic. The charges against him included murdering and eating 14 children and engaging in incestuous relationships with his daughter and another relative. One of the most brutal on record, the execution of Peter Stump, his daughter, and his mistress occurred on October 31st, 1589. The following description comes from Wikipedia. He was put to a wheel where flesh was torn from his body in 10 places with red-hot pincers, followed by his arms and legs. Then his limbs were broken with the blunt side of an axe head to prevent him from returning from the grave, before he was beheaded and his body burned on a pyre. His daughter and mistress had already been flayed and strangled and were burned along with Stump's body. The leaders of the Münster Rebellion. The Münster Rebellion was a movement by followers of Anabaptism to establish a theocracy in Münster, Germany. The leaders of the rebellion were Jan van Leyden, Bernard Krechting, and Bernard Knipperdoling. After the siege and fall of Münster, the 3 men were captured, charged with heretical and treasonous crimes, and sentenced to death. On the day of their execution in 1536, the men were attached to a pole, secured by spiked collars around their necks, and one by one had the flesh ripped from their bodies with burning hot tongs. Their sentence required a full hour of torture before their tongues were ripped out, and they were finally killed by a burning dagger plunged into their hearts. Each of their bodies was placed in a metal cage and hung from the steeple of St. Lambert's Church in Münster. Their remains were displayed there for decades before finally being removed. The cages still hang there today.